for those that don't know me already, as a former, and really quite recently a former civil servant, I've been doing this, this role leading the voluntary sector in adoption just since April. But I was going to have to confess to it anyway, because the first point that I wanted to make about the about if you like the contribution of the voluntary sector, and specifically about the voluntary sector and the statutory sector working in partnership on permanence and adoption specifically, is that I think that they have a really good track record of doing this specifically in adoption, and I think it's just worth sort of starting by reflecting on that for a moment. So when I was head of adoption in the Department for Education in 2011, we had a lot of very angry people in number 10 who were angry because they didn't think the civil servants were jumping up and down fast enough to produce new policy in response to some commitments that the Prime Minister had made at Tory party conference about reforming the adoption system. And Martin Neri had published his great piece in the Times, which framed so much of what the government did immediately in the months after that. And the team of civil servants then in the DfE, just as I joined them, got together a group of leaders from the from local authorities and from the voluntary sector. So Coram was there among them, but a number of other voluntary adoption agencies as well, and there were DCSs from Hampshire and from East Sussex, as well as other people working in the adoption system. And it was a really impressive collaboration. It was called the Expert Working Group, and they redesigned the adopter approval process, came up with the idea for a single front door to the adoption system, which is now First for Adoption. And they did all of this with such impressive speed that they were ready with proposals before the Prime Minister had demanded that the Minister come along and say what they were, and that frankly the civil servants working on it could scarcely keep up with the pace that they were going at. So I think it was innovative, and it was challenging, and it was really productive in terms of ideas. And I think that that's a sort of that felt to me to be a good place to start in terms of thinking about what the contribution of the voluntary sector is to this agenda. So I have been, as I said, CEO of the Consortium of Voluntary Adoption Agencies since April, and I've now visited almost all my member agencies and seen numerous examples of different bits of partnership working, and seen how there's a sort of shared motivation in terms of a commitment to children's outcomes across both of these sectors. And I wanted to share 4 examples of what I think the voluntary sector can bring to the challenge of achieving permanence for children. The first thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of sort of strategic specialism. So because adoption is in many cases all they do, or specific services around permanence may be all an organisation delivers, or a really big part of what an organisation delivers, there is something I think in the specialism and the strategic thinking about a specialism that voluntary sector organisations can bring. Now, Coram have obviously been offering additional strategic adoption specialism to local authorities for years. There are other voluntary organisations that do this too. I've seen After Adoption up in Manchester bringing some business development expertise and additional strategic capacity from the outside to add to the local authorities' reforms of their permanence planning services. We've also seen it we can also see it in other ways. I can see Joanne Alper at the back of the room from Adoption Plus, and I attended earlier on this year a really fantastic conference which was a partnership of London local authorities and the voluntary sector, having bringing across from America a very inspirational speaker, Dan Siegel, to talk for a day about adoption support and the latest neuroscience. And it was a really fantastic day, and it was Joanne's inspiration and her contacts and the level of thought that Adoption Plus are able to give as a specialist adoption support organisation, and sharing that across so many interested people in local authorities in this area. So my first point was about strategic specialism. And the second point is about flexibility and innovation. And I'm going to hark back to my civil service experience again here for a counterpoint. So I have a fair bit of experience in the constraints of working in a large bureaucracy, and I suspect that both Philip and they would recognise that the description of their of where they work as large bureaucracies too. And although I'm not going to suggest that they perhaps go to some of the worst excesses of what central government is capable of, I wanted to give you an example. I was in my last job in the Department for Education, I was responsible for, among other things, implementing the early years pupil premium. And so this was a sort of, a smaller scale equivalent to the school's pupil premium for children who met certain income-based criteria. And one of the things that we needed to do in order to make the policy happen was to have a system for checking the eligibility of the children who would be able to receive the money from government. And in order for that to happen, we needed to explain how we expected people in local authorities to check the eligibility of children who were potentially eligible for the early years pupil premium. So we designed some guidance which tried to explain quite simply and straightforwardly what the process should be for doing this. And we came up against the new Cabinet Office guidelines for gatekeeping all government websites, which said that, very laudable objective, every piece of communications on that website needed to be intelligible to the ordinary person on the street. So we were trying to explain our quite technical guidance about how you might check income-based criteria through a particular online checking system, and we were trying to make that explain that in words that were judged to be the sort of thing that someone just stacking the shelves in Tesco's might be able to understand. And we reached a total impasse. We spent weeks trying to get this simple piece of guidance published, and in the end we turned to a voluntary sector organisation who could put it on their website and make it available in a very straightforward manner, so that people actually had just the sort of technical stuff that they needed in order to be able to implement this policy. Now I know that that's quite an extreme example in some ways, but I thought I have reflected on things like that since moving to the voluntary sector. If you like, the sort of the ability to be nimble and change direction swiftly and do things without having to ask permission or fill in numerous forms, and I can see that in. And also I think to take risks on innovation. Now we heard examples of innovation both in Kent and in Essex, and I know that many of them, I'm not suggesting this is the sole preserve of the voluntary sector, but we're experimenting in the voluntary sector with apps that have a digital interface with charms, so adopters can use it to see where they are in the process in real time. With child-focused recruitment techniques, with new innovative adoption support techniques, some of which are still kind of gaining evidence and research backing, but which we can give a go in the voluntary sector, perhaps before we might be able to do that in the statutory sector. And so it was that sort of flexibility and innovation, which was my second point. The third thing I wanted to talk about is operating across borders. And this is quite a sort of obvious point in a way, but it's something that I find really powerful about the voluntary sector in this area of work, is that it has a very different geographical footprint to that which perhaps which I previously had seen sort of children's services as being about all of the different local authority boundaries, and that was the delivery mechanism that I had in mind when I was thinking about how the system fits together. And the voluntary sector doesn't work like that, of course. It's very different, and I think in a quite a small system with a small number of children overall, it's that is a real resource in helping us to overcome some of the fragmentation that having 152 different local authority pieces can mean, and some of the artificial boundaries that can bring. And we can see this in the voluntary sector. We can see this through individual agencies like Bernardo's that cover the whole country and bring in some of their experience from Scotland and Wales as well. And we can see it in small organisations like SAFA, which does provides a specialist adoption service for the military. So wherever there are service families that want to adopt, or children who benefit from a placement in families with some of the specific strengths that they might find in among the military. And that's again a sort of a national service that doesn't have boundaries. We can see it within regions. There's a collaboration in the Northwest between Adoption Matters and Caritas Care at the moment to bring a concurrent planning service across to a large number of local authorities, so through the partnership of those two voluntary adoption agencies. And increasingly across the sector there are examples of the voluntary sector being able to work as a single unit, sharing innovation, sharing good practice, and I think also in some cases recruiting a family that another voluntary adoption organisation might offer support to. They're starting to know where our strengths are as a sector and what we can bring as a whole. And then my final point is about working outside the system. So I thought it was important just to pause for a moment on the sort of the advantages of the independence from statutory services. So many voluntary organisations provide services in significant quantity to birth families, and in many cases they integrate these into their adoption service. So life story work, integrating birth parent perspectives into adopter training. One agency that I visited the other day includes standard sessions from a birth grandfather and a birth mother, both of which had birth children who were placed with this agency's adopters into their training. And I that again, not a preserve of the voluntary sector, but something perhaps where we have a particular strength. So it was those four themes really around flexible innovation, operating across borders, working outside the system with independence, and critically the strategic specialism in these services that we have, that I thought were worth reflecting on, particularly in the light of the regional agenda. And that was all I had to say, Renika.